Hello and welcome to lecture number 8 in physiological psychology. Today we're going to be talking about genetics and behavior. Primarily we're going to talk about baseline information that you need to know about genetics and how it might relate to behavior. We'll talk more about genetics throughout the course and how genetics alter behavior. But today we're going to talk about getting a baseline understanding and how genetics and behavior are related. So we'll start with the basic introduction about genetics and behavior. Talk for quite a bit of time about Mendelian genetics based on Gregor Mendel's work. Talk about genetic changes, the modern field of epigenetics, heritability, heredity in the environment, how genes affect behavior, the evolution of behavior, a little bit about evolutionary psychology, kin selection, and then finally finish up with epigenetics and heredity. So let's start by talking about genetics and behavior. The primary question here is, does human behavior depend on genetics, environmental influences, or both? This is sort of the classic nature or nurture question. It's simplistic to view all biological processes as being genetically based, but there certainly are genetic bases for a lot of biology of behavior. So something being biological doesn't necessarily make it genetic, but the gene and environment interact in very complex and nuanced ways, as we'll see. So a review of genetics provides a springboard for kind of evaluating those controversial questions, having a good background in all of this material. This helps us start to think about how genetics plays a role in the more complicated behaviors we'll talk about throughout the term. So both genes and environment interact to shape human behavior. This is certainly clear. The fundamental issue here is how much a role each factor plays in shaping human behaviors. So if we're talking about something like intelligence, is it mostly genetic? Is it mostly environment? Is it a gene-environment interaction? And what are the critical environmental factors that interact with genetic factors? These are all very complicated questions. So things like psychological disorders, weight gain, personality, sexual orientation, these are all questions we have tried to figure out what is the genetic component, what's the biological component, what's the psychological component, what's sociological, where do these factors all intersect with one another. And so to give you an example, one of the prevailing theories of schizophrenia is that you have to have a genetic predisposition with an exposure to some sort of immune response, virus, bacteria, who knows, causes an epigenetic change. That is, it changes the way genes are expressed, which results in the disorder known as schizophrenia. So the genetic predisposition has to be there, and then exposure to some environmental event triggers that genetic response that alters behavior and alters neurochemistry and all sorts of other things. So genes and the environment interact in many different ways. So to give you the simplest example, our height is mostly genetic, but some environmental as well. We certainly know people have gotten taller over the years as our nutrition has changed. So we think genes sort of set the range of your height, or certainly maybe the maximum your height will get, depending on how much your environment might contribute to that. So here we're talking about nutrition, possibly exposure to growth hormones, exposure to different kinds of diet. All of these things can interact in complicated ways to result in varying height levels, which is why things like height have changed over time. Some very odd gene-environment interactions are things like foot size. The average shoe size has increased pretty dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years in a way that's certainly not explicable simply through some sort of genetic alteration. Well, in the 19th century, the monk Gregor Mendel demonstrated that inheritance occurs through discrete units of heredity called genes. And so this is what we call Mendelian genetics. This was a remarkable breakthrough in terms of understanding how one set of attributes can get passed on to others or not through this principle of heredity in genes. We know genes come in pairs. These pairs are called alleles, and they're aligned along chromosomes. We, of course, have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So this is a basic introduction to that part of this. We'll talk more about genes and DNA here in a bit. But these alleles are aligned along chromosomes, and these alleles seem to be part of this principle of heredity. So what Gregor Mendel discovered is that an allele is one alternative form of a given allelic pair. So, for example, tall and dwarf are the alleles for the height of a pea plant. More than two alleles can exist for any specific gene, but only two of them will be found within any individual. So remember, genes are made up of specific protein sequences. A, C, T, and G are the letters for those. And so you can end up with any particular set of pairs, but only two of them will be found in any individual. So an allelic pair is the combination of two alleles which comprise the gene pair. An individual who is homozygotic is an individual which contains only one allele at the allelic pair. So for example, if we have a dwarf dominant gene and a dwarf non-dominant gene, or recessive gene, so that's what the uppercase D and the lowercase d is. This double D here is homozygous dominant, and the lower d is homozygous recessive. Pure lines are homozygous for the gene of interest. So we're talking about an individual with a homozygotic allele. It contains both the same alleles. So for example, someone with blue eyes are recessive. They have to have a matched allelic pair for that particular gene. All blue-eyed people are homozygotes for that eye color. Heterozygotes are individuals which contain one of each member of the gene pair. So for example, this would be a dominant and a recessive heterozygote gene pair. So someone with brown eyes, for example, might have the dominant brown eye gene and a recessive blue eye gene, who marries someone with brown eyes, who also has a dominant brown eye and recessive blue eye gene, and then gives birth to a blue-eyed child. I wonder where that happened. Well, it's because they both carry the recessive gene for blue eyes. Genotype, then, is the specific allelic combination for a certain gene or a set of genes. So your genotype sets your eye color, for example. Your genotype, in the case of height, can set what your potential height might be. We talk about your specific height as your phenotype, which is the combination of your genetic and environmental factors and how those genes have ultimately been expressed. So, this is a lot of information to get out. Let's take a look at how this works. So, by looking at the principles of inheritance. So, Mendel discovered dominant and recessive genes for pea color and shape. So, we'll take kind of the simplest way of looking at this. So, he discovered that the round and yellow were dominant genes. Green and wrinkled were recessive genes. So the wrinkled roundness versus the very round, and then yellow versus green. So you can see we have parent 1 that is homozygous for both the dominant round and dominant yellow gene. So all of its offspring will, their offspring together will be round and yellow. Now if the dominant round and dominant yellow mates with any other combination of heterozygous pea plants, their dominant genes will express always. So that's why all of these are round and yellow, because it doesn't matter who they mate with, we'll end up with a dominant round and a dominant yellow, because remember, the round split and the yellow split, and so those dominant traits will always be expressed no matter who they might mate with. Now, when you have dominant round, heterozygous for the dominant round condition, but homozygous for the dominant round condition, but heterozygous for color, you can see that the green color will occur whenever they match with the recessive green color matches with another recessive green color. So here you can see the recessive green color expressing when there is a recessive green color from the other parent. And then finally you see the same thing here, the wrinkled green and the wrinkled and green are the most recessive traits, so only 1 out of 16 offspring in this case are going to have this kind of genetic combination. So this will be a rare combination. In humans, people with red hair and blue eyes, this is the sort of same condition. They're relatively rare. So these same kind of principles of inheritance apply for brown and blue eyes. So we have parent 1, who's homozygous for brown eyes, parent 2, who's homozygous for blue eyes. So if we have 2 parents who are homozygous for brown eyes, all their kids will have brown eyes. If we have 2 parents who are heterozygous for blue eyes, all their kids will have blue eyes. Anytime we have 1 parent that is homozygous for brown eyes, they're going to have nothing but brown-eyed children. It's only when we have a blue-eyed parent who's homozygous for blue, because the only time you end up with blue is when it's homozygous, and they mate with a parent who is heterozygous for brown, or 2 heterozygous for brown parents. That's when you'll end up with blue-eyed offspring. So this is how dominant and recessive traits work together. So a gene is defined as a portion of a chromosome and is composed of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA serves as a model for the synthesis of ribonucleic acid through the creation of messenger RNA. So RNA is a single-strand chemical that can serve as a template or model for the synthesis of protein. So the primary function of DNA and RNA is the creation of different proteins. This is how genes express themselves. So when the gene is expressed, it is creating that specific protein. And one of the things that can happen is through different environmental events, the expression of those proteins can change. And that's a process called epigenetics. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But these are the building blocks for the genetic basis of behavior, are DNA and RNA. And the entire purpose of them is the construction of proteins. We're going to primarily concern ourselves in physiological psychology with the expression of proteins throughout the nervous system. So one of the things we'll talk about is how genetic alterations can change genetic expression in specific ways. So proteins determine the development of the body by forming part of the structure of the body. So this is how our bodies develop. They also serve as enzymes or biological catalysts that regulate chemical reactions in the body. So one of the things that these proteins can do is, for example, break down substances using the cytochrome P450 enzymes. So most drugs are metabolized using those enzymes. And one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about pain and analgesia is that there are different genotypes for the creation of one of those cytochrome P450 enzymes. And as a result, some people over-metabolize painkillers and create more pain-killing medication throughout that metabolic process, and others create very little. And so people get either too much drug or not enough drug based on their genetics. And so that has to do with these enzymes and the genes that they have creating them. So genetic expression is this process of producing proteins. And so that genetic expression of, for example, that cytochrome P enzyme is what produces that enzyme, and then either overproduces or underproduces it depending on the specific genotype of the individual we're talking about. So genes, it turns out, can be turned on and off. And this is an important part of understanding the creation of proteins and also how our experiences and environmental experiences can alter our behavior through alterations of our genes. So to take a look at this, we have our DNA, which is a sort of self-replicating molecule. Then RNA copies one strand of that DNA, and then part of that RNA can be used to create proteins. And so this creates specific proteins based on this RNA sequence. And that determines these amino acid combinations that create those proteins. So an individual who is homozygous for a gene means that a person has an identical pair of genes on the two chromosomes. Being heterozygous for a gene means that a person has an unmatched pair of genes on the two chromosomes. So when we get into this dominant and recessive part, that's what we're talking about. So this is getting back to those P's or eye color. This is where we're talking about homozygous and heterozygous zygosity for specific genes. As we talked a little bit already, genes are either dominant, recessive, or they can be intermediate. So things like eye color, a dominant gene shows a strong effect in either the homozygous or heterozygous condition, and again we saw that when we looked at those Mendelian charts. And a recessive gene shows its effect only in the homozygous condition. So we've talked about this a little bit already when we looked at both the P's and the eye color charts, but this specifically outlines exactly the conditions under which you get a recessive gene expression is only in that homozygous condition, and in a heterozygous condition the dominant gene will always be expressed. Autosomal genes are all other genes except for sex-linked genes. Sex-linked genes are genes located on the sex chromosome. So primarily these are on the unmatched pair of the Y chromosome. So the sex chromosome are donated as X and Y. So for females, most females have two X chromosomes, and most males have an X and a Y chromosome. We'll see later that that's not always the case. One of the things that results in sex-linked traits are those in which there is something on the unmatched pair, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So for example, the gene that codes for the red and green or middle and long wavelength photopigments, sorry I got those backwards, red is long, green is the middle wavelength photopigments in the eye, is on this unmatched part of the X chromosome, and as a result, if you are missing that gene on the X chromosome, it's not on the Y chromosome, and so your result is you'll end up with a color vision deficiency or a lack of that specific protein. Females very rarely have that condition because it would have to be on both X chromosomes. So during reproduction, of course, females contribute an X chromosome, males contribute either an X or a Y chromosome, and this is what mostly determines the sex of the child. We'll take a closer look at that when we talk about sex here in a few weeks. If an X chromosome is contributed by the male, the offspring is generally female. And if a Y chromosome is contributed by the male, the offspring will generally be male. So sperm is entirely what determines the sex of, almost entirely determines what is the sex of offspring. Because women have two X chromosomes and males have an X or a Y. The human Y chromosome has genes for far fewer proteins than the X chromosome. Thus, sex-linked genes usually refer to X-linked genes. So something like red-green color deficiency, if someone's missing that gene on the X chromosome, it's not matched on the Y chromosome, and as a result, it'll be missing altogether. So these sex-linked genes are genes that are present in both sexes, but mainly have an effect in one sex. Sorry, sex-limited genes. Sex-linked genes refer to X-linked genes. Sex-limited genes are genes that are present in both sexes, but mainly have an effect on one sex, so something like chest hair, breast size, etc. So these are genes that only express in one sex or the other in general. So they're limited to one sex or the other, whereas sex-linked genes are specifically linked to X-linked genetics. It starts to get a little complicated, I know. So that's Mendelian genetics. These are the principles of inheritance that are all linked to these allelic pairs. We'll take a look at some of these specific genes and how they're associated with behavior throughout the semester. So this is a baseline part of understanding genetics. One of the things that can happen is our genes can change in several ways. Our genes can undergo a mutation, which is a heritable change in a DNA molecule. This can happen due to random changing of proteins, or it can happen due to epigenetic alterations that are then handed down, which we'll talk about here in a bit. You can also get microduplication or microdeletion. And this is what happens when part of a chromosome that might appear once might appear twice or not at all. So it can either duplicate or be deleted. So we can get these small duplications or deletions. Some researchers believe that schizophrenia might be a result of microduplications and microdeletions of brain-relevant genes. It appears that bipolar disorder is due to this what's called repeat nucleotide expansion. It gets worse with each sort of successive generation where that trait is expressed. Essentially, each generation adds on another part of this nucleotide sequence, and as a result, you kind of end up with much worsening bipolar disorder over multiple generations. Very important field in psychology, in particular physiological psychology, is the field of epigenetics. And this is a field that is concerned with changes in gene expression without the modification of the DNA sequence itself. So what this is modifications in the expression of genes without changing the DNA sequence itself. So some genes are active only at certain points in one's life or certain times of day, and they kind of turn on and off. So some genes are active while you're going through puberty or when you're an infant, but not later in life, or they're only active at certain times of the day, certain times of your hormone cycle, etc. Changes in gene expression are central to learning and memory. In fact, that seems to be part of the molecular basis for our memory. We certainly know our experiences can cause genetic changes or epigenetic alterations in the expressions of proteins in the brain. So epigenetic differences are a likely explanation for differences seen between monozygotic or so-called identical twins. So for example, while an identical twin with schizophrenia is more likely to have the second twin with schizophrenia, it's not 100%. Similarly with homosexuality, a male twin who's homosexual, more likely that their twin is also gay, but not necessarily. So there may be some epigenetic differences in the expression of these proteins that can explain these differences in expressed behavior between monozygotic or identical twins. So one of the things that we know happens is we can get activation or deactivation of certain genes. Some of this is what we call histone modification. Get a little more into the details of this here in a few moments and how this may get handed down. But basically, what you do at any moment not only affects you now, but can produce epigenetic effects that alter gene expressions for a longer period of time. So for example, there's a great deal of interest in looking at how drug abuse might alter protein expression in individuals who have used cocaine or heroin, and then how might that affect their behavior over time, and how might that affect their offspring or the offspring of their offspring. We've seen in some studies epigenetic alterations that are still visible 2 generations away from the original index event. This is a really important part of trying to study how environment affects behavior. So our experiences can alter the activities of genes, and the kinds of things they can do that are things like drug use that I've just been talking about. Certainly stress, long-term excessive stress can cause epigenetic alterations. There is emerging evidence that that kind of long-term stress causes changes in genetic expression that are then passed on to the next generation. And so people that grow up in high-stress poverty environments can end up passing down altered genes as a result of that experience. So this is a really important area for us to study. This gets right at this question of heritability. So this refers to how much characteristics depend on genetic differences. So researchers have found evidence for heritability in almost every behavior you test. Preference for jazz, political affiliation, all of these seem to have a certain heritability component. So heritability of a certain trait can be specific to a given population, strong environmental influences may cause genetic influences to have less of an effect. So some populations may be more likely to have a particular trait, but that may also be affected by environmental influences. So for example, the BRCA gene is one that is associated with significantly elevated breast cancer and ovarian cancer risk. This is associated with certain populations. And so those populations are urged to both think about genetic testing, but also to monitor their breast cancer and ovarian cancer risk to a great extent. It's not 100% hereditary because there are environmental influences determining whether or not those genetic influence express themselves or not. So this gets us right at how heredity and environment interact with one another. Almost all behaviors have both a genetic and an environmental component. So what we tend to do to study this is we look at monozygotic and dizygotic twins to infer contributions of heredity and environment. So monozygotic twins, of course, share 100% of their DNA, whereas dizygotic twins only share 50% of their DNA. And we can assume that monozygotic and dizygotic twins that are raised together have relatively similar environmental exposure and environmental risk. Now, it's not 100%, but certainly we can start to tease apart these kind of influences. We can also look at adopted children and their resemblance to their biological parents to infer hereditary influences. So if there is an influence between adopted children and their biological parents, that's obviously hereditary and not environmental because they're not raised by their parents, or at least somewhat. We can have more belief that that is more hereditary, but certainly monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins provide some pretty specific information that we've looked at. In fact, in the previous lecture we looked at how diffusion tensor imaging has been able to look at how connectivity in the brain is possibly hereditary in specific brain areas. So traits with strong hereditary influence can be modified by environmental interactions. So people who have what's called phenylketonuria is a genetic inability to metabolize the amino acid phenylalanine. Early intervention results in perfectly normal development of people with PKU because they simply avoid anything with the amino acid phenylalanine in it. And as a result, they can develop perfectly normal. Now, if you don't catch that, it's pretty devastating to those patients who do not know that they have PKU and consume phenylalanine. As a result, they end up with some pretty dramatic alterations in their development. So how do genes affect behavior, potentially? Well, genes do not directly produce behaviors, that much is clear. Genes produce proteins that can increase the probability that a behavior will or will not develop under certain circumstances. That's a really important thing to understand. Genes are not destiny. There are significant gene-environment interactions. Genes are more associated with probabilities, and if they mix with the right or wrong environmental circumstances, then they're more likely to be expressed. Genes can also, of course, have indirect effects. They can alter your environment by producing behaviors or traits that alter how people in your environment react to you. So these kinds of interactions are very complicated. So people who have an inability to create facial expressions, which there are specific disorders we'll talk about when we talk about emotion, those people have very different upbringings because people react to them very differently. Similarly, people who have autism, part of what happens with their social skills is because people react to them very differently. So we always have to be mindful of how these behaviors interact with one another. So the last places to talk are about evolutions of behavior and how evolutionary psychology is related to this discussion. So evolution refers to a change in the frequency of various genes in a population over generations. So we're talking about how natural selection selects out some behaviors to be more likely than others. So oftentimes we'll consider how some sort of sensory system or brain system is adaptive. That is, how does it help us survive? So our visual system is cued in specific ways. Our auditory system is tuned in specific ways. Why are those adaptive? Why has evolution favored those changes over time? So an important thing to understand is this evolution can occur whether the change is helpful or harmful to the species. Sometimes evolution selects some things that aren't particularly helpful to us. So some of the things that have benefited human beings 10,000 years ago don't benefit us now. So the design, for example, of our skulls and our brain are not conducive to high-velocity accidents, like car accidents. So evolution has not favored us to have car accidents and survive them very well. But that's because we haven't really, those things haven't had a chance to affect our evolution because they happen so quickly. So remember, evolutionary changes are slow over time, but evolution attempts to answer two questions. How did some species evolve, and how do species evolve? And so some of these questions, of course, get at why are things adaptive, why do they help species survive, thinking about whether or not some behavior is based in some sort of survival instinct, but you also, of course, always have to put these questions in a context. So one of the problems with evolutionary psychology on its own is we try to treat humans as animals who don't live in a social context. And we're able to govern our behavior in ways that other species are not. So when people talk about sexual behavior and evolution, you always have to keep in mind that these things occur in a social context, and the social context will oftentimes greatly override any evolutionary drive that you might be thinking about. So how species evolve rests on some assumptions. Offspring generally resemble their parents for genetic reasons. Mutations, recombination, and microduplications of genes introduce new heritable variations. Certain individuals successfully reproduce more than others. And as a result, those individuals that reproduce more than others are likely to pass on their genes. So these mutations, recombinations, and microduplications of genes that introduce these new heritable variations, if they are adaptive, if they are increasing the survival, they're more likely to get passed on. So these random accidents that result in genetic variations are more likely to be passed on if they're more likely to be successful. And so there's a reason why some things are very rare in animal species in the wild. So for example, albino alligators, very rare. They'll very rarely survive. The only time they usually survive is if they have been found in and raised in captivity, because they're so easy to spot that they generally don't survive to adulthood because they're just simply become prey for other species because they can't hide out in green grass, for example. Whereas other characteristics may help them reproduce more than others. And so really this is where you get that survival of the species, survival of the fittest. So evolutionary psychology then focuses upon functional and evolutionary explanations of natural selection. These are things like, this assumes that behavioral characteristics of a species have arisen through natural selection and provide a survival advantage. So things like differences in peripheral color vision. Some species have very specific adaptations to their visual systems. Snakes have the ability to perceive in ultraviolet light. Raptor species such as hawks, eagles, owls, etc. Seem to be able to see in the near infrared, so they can actually see heat coming off of prey. Those kinds of adaptations are designed to help them survive. Sleep mechanisms in the brain. We sleep at night because that's when most of the predators are out, so that we're out, up, and moving during the day. Eating habits for most species does help them. People, not so much. Our ability to eat on our own naturally does not result in very good nutrition, as I'm sure you've figured out. So some behaviors are more debatable with regard to the influence of natural selection. Some things like lifespan, like why do we live the length of time we do? Well, that's clearly not very genetic, because our lifespan has increased dramatically over the last 100 years. In fact, we're now to the point where we're probably living longer than we're really supposed to. There's some people that think that Alzheimer's, for example, is natural aging at the ages we're now living to, and that belief is that if you lived long enough, you might actually, everybody might end up with Alzheimer's. But that's certainly under debate, for sure. Things like gender differences and sexual promiscuity, people attribute that to natural selection. I'm not sure that that's really genuine or not. Other questions of things like altruistic behavior, behavior that benefits someone other than the actor, that's something that's hard to define outside of humans, or hard to find outside of humans. And so whether or not altruistic behavior is something that developed as part of natural selection is an open question. So there are evolutionary psychologists who believe that women tend to do more what's called tend and befriend than fight or flight. And that tend and befriend means helping others, tending to others, and that then results in sort of group cohesion and group safety. Whether or not that's been developed is another question. So group and kin selection are an important part of this process. The gene only spreads if individuals with it reproduce more than individuals without it. So that benefits the species, but not the individual. And it dies out with the individual. So only those who pass that gene on are likely to benefit the species. There's this idea of what's called group selection. This is a controversial hypothesis that states that altruistic groups survive better than less cooperative ones, and that has to do with this passing on of altruistic genes. This is a very controversial question. There are some clear behaviors designed at maximizing genetic variability. So we tend to, for example, be sexually attracted to people who don't smell anything like us, which is a really weird thing. But the idea is that people who don't smell like us are genetically different from us, and as a result, we're more likely to find them sexually attractive. So this idea about kin selection is selection for a gene that benefits the individual's relatives. This might be more plausible. So it might be whatever characteristic your relatives are lacking, you might select that kind of gene. The final note here is about epigenetics and heredity, and I finished with this note because I think it's one of the most important in this field. There's emerging evidence that alterations in genetic expression are inherited by subsequent generations. So this raises important possibilities. There are generational effects of stress, poverty, and drug abuse. That is, an individual who is raised in a high-stress, poverty environment will have genetic alterations that are then passed on to their next generation. How those genetic alterations affect the behavior of that next generation is a really important open question. So when we talk about things like decades of poverty and how to solve that as a problem, one of the things we're going to have to look at is this question, because people who try to claim that the welfare state has failed probably don't understand this particular issue. So you have to think about how these generational effects of poverty might have effects on subsequent generations. And as a result, we have to start thinking more broadly about how stress and poverty affects offspring, and whether or not people might be born with some sort of disadvantage because of that. Certainly we know there's alterations. How they affect behavior is a whole new question. The final thing, and very interesting question this raises, is we might have the potential to inherit memories, because memories, we believe, are based on these genetic expression changes. So it's possible we might inherit some memories from relatives. Still looking for evidence for that, but it's an important and interesting question that I'll leave you with. We'll talk about brain development and plasticity in our next lectures.